This is the Doubtless Podcast, here to help you change from a state of doubt and insecurity towards a more calm, confident, and doubtless self. I'm your host, coach and psychologist Julian, and my guests are remarkable, ambitious humans who share their stories of doubtful moments, of their insecurities, and how that shaped their successes today. I'm so looking forward to it because I just mentioned already so many topics I want to talk to you about. And for now, I want to just start with the interesting personality that I perceive by going through all your content, which is like you always wanted to be a writer. You said that in so many aspects. You started writing, but it was so difficult to make a living out of that. And then you switched through like going a bit into the commercial aspect of writing and learned about that in your further history. And now when I look at all the stuff that you're doing now, I'm a bit surprised, to be honest. You created the Big Self School, and you're an Enneagram coach, and you go really deep into the human psyche, the human mind, which is obviously intriguing to me. And you also created now, I guess, renamed the podcast, The Humanist, which I'm like, oh, okay. And some of those topics also were very interesting regarding psychedelics, regarding really understanding so many aspects of the human expression of emotions, of anger, of purpose, desire, calm, the mind. So I think we have a lot to talk about. And one of the key aspects that at least comes up all the time is the Enneagram. And as I mentioned just before this, is that I'm very interested about it, but I always had difficulties like entering this diagram, I guess. Yeah. Because when I read through the description, and we'll dive into what the Enneagram is, but first off, when I read through the description of the 9 types that the Enneagram consists out of, I resemble myself with 2 specifically, which is the number 2 or type 2 and type 5. And then right before, earlier, I did another test and it gave me the 9. So can I just start by you just giving a little intro of what the Enneagram is, and then maybe you can jump into, okay, how do I figure this out for myself now?
Okay. Yeah. So as a very top level, because I was reflecting on this. I'm doing a training in a couple of days, and they are an Enneagram curious bunch. And it's like, well, why are we going to spend so much time learning the Enneagram? And I suddenly had this thought that, when you use other typologies, like say Myers-Briggs, or even a good one like Strength Finders, or so many organizations use the DISC assessment, and generally speaking, they are, and I know I'm speaking very broadly, but generally they are descriptive of behaviors, which is, sure, that's helpful on a little bit of a level of self-awareness, describing my behavior and understanding it more as an archetype and a universal pattern, and it's not quite so individual to me, even though some people say, oh, that's labeling me. But when you learn the Enneagram, you are learning far more than a mere typology. You are learning a tool that will help you to work with for the rest of your life in self-coaching or in a coaching context. There are very specific ways for this self-understanding to be able to be applied and practiced, integrating body, emotions, and head but it's a lifelong practice. It's possible to do it without the Enneagram, but boy, is the Enneagram really useful in this application.
What does it make it special to maybe some of the other personality tests that are out there?
Yeah. There are different entry points in, but what particularly stands out about the Enneagram is besides being merely descriptive, it also immediately has insight for us into what are the motivations behind these behaviors that lead to sometimes behaviors that may seem the same on the surface, which may be a little bit of like, well, I'm reading descriptions of my behavior and it sounds like it could be 9, 2, or 5. Well, why would those some of the qualities of those behavioral patterns sound somewhat like me? Well, we can get further into it by understanding some of the core motivations behind why one would be boundaried or one would be more other referencing than self-referencing, and just on and on and on. But to really, one of the entry points that I like, and we don't have to go here, but I'm just saying, one of the entry points that I really like about the Enneagram are the centers of intelligence. And if you're generally more of a body type, generally more lead with being a heart type, or generally lead more with being a head type. We all have all three of them in us, but it's like what's more predominant. And that helps give a lot of immediate insight into thinking of our overall type and our response to each other. And if you didn't know anything about the Enneagram at all, I just love the context. I use this in this kind of ontological coaching I'm seeing it more and more and more in a variety of creative disciplines, of professional disciplines. This idea of like getting embodied and listening to our body and connecting that to what's going on in our emotional world. And then how is our head and our psyche fueling and keeping some of these things alive? So the Enneagram does that as well. And the more I think we understand these, so the Enneagram is, as a symbol that you mentioned, that symbol is ancient and it's powerful and it's really fascinating and it's like mathematical in a Pythagorean way that I think it even goes beyond them, and like how they were explaining the entire universe through mathematics. And yes, this symbol, it's ancient and rich, and it goes into all of the world, like the Hermetic kind of mystical religious traditions. They do all seem to have borrowed this ecumenical symbol, trying to connect how theology is really all one thing. But if we just push that aside and all of that complexity and we just go, well, but what we're actually talking about when we say the Enneagram is the Enneagram of personality. And that's really only been developed, like kind of like anything that we've learned for the past 120 years about personality through psychodynamics and through those, Freud and Adler and Jung and many contributors. We have been working throughout at least the 20th century on understanding and putting together these patterns. And the Enneagram of personality does that. I don't know how much you want to know about this part, and I can stop me at any time, but just real briefly, it did get started, the Enneagram of personality, from Oscar Ichazo, who was a Chilean, and I think it was around the 50s, and it was then into the 60s. What's interesting about his story, he was an incredible intellect. But he inherited, I think it was from an uncle. He didn't get a rich inheritance. He got an inheritance of a library, of literally a library of all of these ancient religious texts. And he began doing this work with this ancient, wild, mysterious symbol of the Enneagram and all of the other psychological theory available to him. And he created the Arica school. And there was another Chilean who had been working in the West, in the United States. His name was Claudio Naranjo. He was about the same age as, he was a peer. And he visited the Eureka School, got really inspired by it, and he got permission eventually to use these teachings, take them to the West through his psychological theory and work. And basically, I think it was 1971 in Berkeley, California, where he, Claudio Naranjo, began teaching the Enneagram. So it's only 50-ish years old as we understand it in that way. And the reason that they were apprehensive or slow to share a lot of these insights was because they rightly, in many respects, feared the over transmission of like this valuable, wise, insightful thing. I mean, that's the philosophy behind all the Hermetic mystical traditions is they're like, this is a special knowledge for few. It should not be available to everyone. But obviously, we're grateful and thankful that it has been. And yes, in many ways, as so many things get eaten up in our capitalistic culture, there is a shallow application of it. There are ways in which it is probably mistaught or misunderstood. But for those who really seek to understand it, it's powerful, and it's powerful on a personal level, interrelationally with like, Joseph Adler says all problems are interpersonal relationship problems. And so like it helps us with our close other and our spouse and our important other. It helps us with like if we're raising kids, and that's just in this personal sphere. It helps us. It is, a lot of people don't really embrace it as much in the professional community because I think of its association with spirituality. And they're like, well, I don't know. I think we'd rather use the DISC assessment or just, but it is incredibly, and it's proven to be very powerful in work environments. I want to see it embraced more there. And then also, yes, it does lead. And, one thing I want to explore more as well is like when one just wants to enter through, like, say, hey, I don't know about the spiritual stuff, but let's just see how deep we can go psychologically. Let's explore the mind, right? And then you begin to see, well, where is this dividing line between consciousness and what's going on in my mind and how I define what is soul and what is spirit. And I think spirituality is sort of like an even higher level dimension and discipline beyond mere, like, let me cut everything off and just be in my head.
Yeah, I think there's what I notice also when people start talking about the Enneagram, that there's immediately, for a lot of people, sort of resistance, like, oh, another person talking about the Enneagram, or like some sort of, oh, the personality test, what is that going to teach me? So that's why I wanted to just really dive into it and see, okay, what does it actually do, rather than, work on the perceptual or resistance level. So that's why I want to be this lab rat now and see, okay, how can I actually understand it for myself better too? So going really, really openly in this. And I think this background already gives a little idea on where it comes from, where it's been created. And, can you give a little idea on the purpose of the personality aspect of the Enneagram? Do you know why it was created?
Why? Well, I would say self-awareness leads to, so like, Socrates says that the sum total, like if I had to summarize what all of this philosophy was all about, all of these, it's know thyself, 2 words. And whenever we're having these interpersonal relationship problems, or we look at the world and we're distressed by things that are not in our control, in order to create the change that we want, and in order to see different results, we must start with ourselves. And for me to start with myself as a personal anecdote related to really thinking about that, just that idea of starting with yourself. It was like 2019, and our oldest son was going just through some massive, without sharing all of his story, he was going through some big struggles. And so as a family, we were all in a struggle. And we went to a coach psychologist, and he was familiar, or he was really steeped in Bowen theory, which is family systems. And we're that idea of like we're all connected in a web, and you can have your identified victim, and you can have your triangle of a persecutor and a savior and all of the, but as long as this person is your identified victim, then you're going to continue in this same flow of the dynamics. And so what was the overall message? Start with yourself. If you want to change this dynamic, Chad, and others in the dynamic in the family, you start with yourself. What are you doing? What are your beliefs? What are your actions? How? And so I began really embracing that idea, and I have now seen how that translates across the board. It is one of the very first stepping stones of coaching, of this idea of taking radical responsibility and not going into the more actually comfortable mindset of being kind of a victim, because it's just this weird human thing that even if we don't like the reality that we're experiencing, it's the reality we know. And rather than going to a reality that we don't know, which is just way more uncomfortable, it's way easier to kind of feed that the stories that we tell ourselves that tend to keep us locked in those same patterns. I don't know if I'm directly answering your question, but I think that a personality system, like I think maybe Oscar Ichazo saw this, the possibilities of what was understood as this ancient symbol that was attempting to describe a universal pattern in nature. And then he saw, well, there began to be an insight and a connection of like, well, just from a human point of view, are there a sort of like a sum total of archetypes of like personalities that the human brings? And then they looked at ancient literature, and they looked at different sources, like Evagrius, a monk in the 4th century, came up with like, he saw 8 of these like common patterns of, spiritual, he called them like spiritual lassitude, or ways that people strayed from the path. And they're similar to what we define as these 9 patterns. 9, 10 is considered to like bring wholeness together. And so there seems to be these 9 incredibly universal patterns. Like, it doesn't matter gender, it doesn't matter culture, it doesn't matter work content or whatever, they seem to really hold. So I guess, like we look for self-understanding and ways to, why else would we want such a model? It's like anything that gives us a toehold on being able to understand our complex selves, and then like, not that there's shortcuts to how we practice, but if there's like insight, right, which is a form of a shortcut, like knowing that other people have behaved in these ways that can say, hey, we're not labeling you, you're simply maybe unaware that you're operating in one of these 9 basic archetypes. That's why I keep using that word, like these like habitual patterns. And for you to be able to see that, then you can go, okay, I am in this prison, right? I'm in that, whatever we want to say, I'm in this container. Do I think that the container's perfectly fine and I want to stay in it now that I'm actually able to see the container a little more clearly? Maybe, but at least then I have a little bit more choice. Do I want to get out of the container?
Yeah.
Do I want to be free from, and Gurdjieff would talk a lot about that idea. And he goes to like the 1920s, right? When he opened his school in Paris, G.I. Gurdjieff, and he did use the Enneagram, but not the Enneagram of personality, such as we understand it now. But he was using it very much in trying to, hey, use the Enneagram to balance your centers, balance your heart, head, emotions, and body. And he would very much emphasize, hey, we're mechanical. We're machines, and we're doing all of this stuff on autopilot that we don't even know. We're asleep to ourselves even while we're awake. Do you want to wake up? And I think that like most people don't really necessarily want to wake up.
Yes, it's a fun way to end, because I think it is the comfort that we know how things have been that keeps us in those same patterns. Not necessarily that different ways might be worse, but the same pattern gives some sort of security. And so I found it also very good that you described not to put people in boxes, but to describe the container that they're currently in and see, okay, you're doing this right now. Are you aware of this?
Right.
If not, hey, this is what's happening. Maybe you want to change or not. Both is fine.
Right.
And so maybe we can do that now and check. Okay, well, if I'm in a container, I want to know, because I want to have the choice, right? I want to have the choice.
Exactly.
And so right now, it looks to me like, I guess quite some people would probably describe themselves as, hey, I know about myself. I know myself.
Yes.
I've done self-insight tests. I've done personality tests. I'm reflective. A lot of people would, I think there was a survey, 80% of executives would describe themselves as self-reflective or self-reflected. So I'm one of those now. Let's just say I feel like I'm self-reflected. However, I feel like I'm in 3 containers at the same time. And so you described already there are 9 personality types in the Enneagram. And we don't have to maybe go through all of them. I guess if people really want to dive into that, they probably should, check out some resources, go to your website. But let's maybe just create a way on how people can find this stuff out for themselves by using just my example now. So what I noticed is I happily identify with type 2, which I learned is sort of the helper, the maybe listener, the giver, the person that wants to make other people feel good. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I guess part of the reason why I do the podcast is the investigator. I'm curious. I want to understand the world. I want to know how things work. And then I was doing the test of some free website, just a free test, and it gave me the peacemaker, so the type 9, which I'm like, yeah, that fits too. Whenever there's conflict, I'm almost out the window. So, like I've read through descriptions and people told me on YouTube, like, yeah, you shouldn't do a test. Actually read through the things and you will notice which one resonates the most with you. So I'm in this dilemma right now. How can I gain some insight with the Enneagram and learn a bit about myself, as possible now in this relative short time in the podcast recording?
Wow, that's a fun challenge. And yeah, interesting that, if you typed at different times or see yourself in the container of 2, 5, and 9, each of those is in a different center of intelligence, the 2 being a heart type, the 5 a head type, and the 9 a body type. So as you're saying that, it almost strikes me that maybe we should like wheel around the circle and also think about if we could wheel around the circle, kind of briefly describe the types.
Okay.
And also, I think maybe we should think of what is this thing called the centers of intelligence and what does it mean to be a body, heart, or head type? Then we can begin to process it. But even beyond that, I would say that one of the, we do conduct typing interviews as well. And yeah, I agree with your friend saying you don't need a test. You can read and then you self-observe and you think. But one of the important ways to self-observe is to understand what is the passion of each of the types, because a passion is basically like your lower level general emotional disposition. And as you self-observe and you become more aware of like paying attention to knowing what to be looking for, you begin to see it more. And the ego is super clever, and our ego does mask a lot. It's the ego is important, right? It's kept us alive. It's how we engage with others. It's not to this misunderstood thing of just slaying the ego, not literally. That would be to like fall into dissolution and barely be able to function. But it's to loosen the grip of the ego in order to free us up, in order to be able to not be walled within being in personality is kind of how we say it, which generally means, hey, in certain ways, being in this type, being in personality is functional for you. And this is why like a lot of people don't want to necessarily give it up, right? It's like I have learned from a very early age, and it's held on to me throughout my entire life. It's got being in this personality structure gets me out of a lot of situations. I'm able to handle stress. I've gotten the job. I've created the identity of who I am around it. And now you're saying loosen the hold of this thing. But what does happen is usually it's around midlife. We come into the limitations of what the ego can do for us. And some people, over the long haul, they just kind of accept it, or they double down on just saying, no, this is who I am. Or you can kind of take that hero's journey and say, no, I'm going to see this and I'm going to like try to grow in a whole nother level of possibility for myself in generally speaking, the second half of my life. So let's see. Let's wheel around the circle first. The idea of the centers of intelligence. This is, I think, Julian, you'll really dig this.
Okay.
So there are three body types, 3 heart types, and 3 head types. And what does it mean to be? It's less clear to define what does it mean to be a body type. It's a little easier to name the heart and the head types, because a body type, an 8, a 9, or a 1, a body type doesn't, again, we have all 3 of these. We all have a thing, we're 3-brained beings, but this is how they lead, right? This is how we lead. So in the dominant position is a way of responding to circumstances that is embodied, that does not need to filter reality through thinking about it in a reflexive way, nor to how am I relating or feeling about it, but it's just pure embodied. And they say that because it's embodied, this gut kind of knowing, it's the fastest way to respond because there's no having to filter this reality.
Just to throw in some words on maybe understand about it, is it also somewhat related to the intuition, the gut feeling, this response that is just like an inner knowing and you just do it?
Great question. And I like that you use the word intuition, because a lot of times I think intuition is misunderstood as just being emotional, but body types have a embodied intuition, and just as heart types have an embodied emotion, and head types can have a very head type intuition. So yes, it is this way of like, kind of like, this is how, and you kind of think until you know better, you kind of think, isn't this how everybody reacts and responds to being at this? So, um, what's interesting about each of, and this is where some psychological theory is super helpful with the body types. They say that this literature came from around the 1920s, the same time as Jung was working on a lot of his psychological theory. But it's that body types needed holding. So there was a frustration in being held. Heart types needed mirroring, and head types needed practicing. So we'll hold that idea. And so within that context of getting it, that it's not that those needs aren't completely being met. So how do these body types respond to frustration with like not getting their needs met through holding? And what they develop is a very unconscious kind of an anger. So the emotional thing for body types is a relationship to anger. An emotional thing for the heart types is a relationship to sadness as a result of maybe not getting this mirroring. And then for the head types, as a result of not getting the practicing that they needed, it results in fear. So we've got anger, sadness, and fear. And I'll address like, well, why are all these kind of negative? We can address that at another time, but let's just stick with this idea of, so 8s, 9s, and 1s all have this relationship to a very unconscious, broadly speaking, a kind of an anger that's been internalized. And 8s, the challenger, as they call them traditionally, they overdo that expression of anger. They create an invulnerability and they project this powerful persona, while the 9s, as often called the peacemaker, the modest mediator, if you know, they fall asleep, they underdo their response to anger. And then there's always a type that is an ambivalence kind of, and so 1s, they are as a body type, they're the perfectionist, right? And they're like trying to do it just right. They're aware, they're feeling the anger, but they're also trying to be good, and they're trying to do things just right, and they're trying to be above reproach. And so they're holding it in, but a lot of times it's a blind spot because they're holding it in, but it's leaking out and they're not aware of it, but others are feeling it. So I think this is helping us get some insight right off the bat, right? Without even having to just do general descriptions. And then so we just did the body types. Let's move on. Let's do these heart types, 2s, 3s, and 4s. The 2, traditionally called the helper, it's a strategic kind of helping. They are often mistyped with 9s, by the way, because 9s and 2s are so other referencing. But we'll discuss like maybe the differences there. 2s are they're the ones in ambivalence to the sadness. They are super sensitive and very emotional, but they also are like, but I'm trying to meet your needs. I'm not thinking of my needs. I want everyone to sort of love me and meet my needs because you can see how amazing I am for you. And
so it's almost like a trick, like you're giving in order to instantaneously receive some sort of validation back, or I've given, so I deserve something to be given back, or something.
That is exactly it with the 2s. But to be fair, for all these descriptions, it's usually really unconscious, you know? And so that's why this stuff helps. But it can be vulnerable work because you're kind of being like, oh my gosh. And now everyone's hearing that's what, okay. So 2s are in ambivalence to the sadness, as we keep trying to wheel around here for a moment without taking up too much time. And 3s with the sadness relationship, they're underdoing sadness You could say running from it. They're too busy being a productive performer, being an achiever. They're in the middle of the heart types. And yet it's hard to see how they are emotional or a heart type, at least on the surface. They're very shape shifting because they're trying to like be the most amazing version of what the culture admires. And that's why a lot of people want to be threes. The US is a three culture. And a lot of people are like, yeah, I want to be upbeat and sunshiny and checking off things on my to-do list. And, everyone sees me as being the valedictorian so a lot of people do want to be threes. There is no better number. There is no better personality response. It's just a cultural value. Okay, so as we're continuing to go around, fours, the last of our heart types, they overdo their response to sadness, expressing it. And no one can possibly understand the depth of the complexity of my emotions, which I can handle. And so, that's where some of that, like, the romantic and the creative but also fours can be in any walk of life. They're not just necessarily creatives. But if they're not, they really value authenticity. They want to be on purpose. They want to be doing something missional that lines up with their values. Okay. So moving on now to head types, 5, 6s, and 7s. You may be a 5. Who knows? You may be any of the types you didn't even type for. Well, the 5s are in terms of their relationship to the core emotional unconscious thing of fear, they are in ambivalence to it because they're feeling it, but they're protecting themselves with their boundaries. Sometimes it's physical boundaries. Sometimes it's very often emotional boundaries with the 5s. It's like, I really need my space. And and they don't, I guess, they don't really allow themselves to be alive to what's happening in the present moment because even they are sensitive. This is one of the things that's overlooked about 5s because they project coolness and they project aloofness and because they're often quiet, very reserved, often introverted, and in new work environments and situations where they don't feel comfortable with knowing they can be quiet. Then when they finally do feel like they've accumulated the necessary knowledge that they need, they could speak at length. They like depth in that way, not shallow cocktail conversations. And in like a party kind of environment, they're going to you'll notice that it's 5s will do a lot of like, you'll suddenly know you've been talking to a 5 for 30 minutes and you don't know the first thing about them because they have this way of continuing to ask you curious questions, but keeping it kind of off of them because of this boundary. Moving on to 6s, they overdo fear.
Just highlighting that some of the parts, I think also for the listener, when they listen to each of those parts, now I noticed with the 5 was more like I felt seen to an extent of like, oh yeah, I do that. I notice, So for anyone who's listening to that, like when there's this reaction of like, that's funny because it's true, then I guess that's a good sign for noticing.
I'm so glad that you put it that way because that is exactly what does happen in a lot of trainings, especially like when people just kind of barely know or they're sort of like, and then it's like, they're like, oh, okay. That's sometimes you just feel like, yeah, like nail on head. Not always, and you should really be open-minded to the possibilities. We'll talk about that in a minute. Let's see. 6s overdoing their relationship to fear. They project it out as the skeptical troubleshooter. It's kept them. They're like, well, I might let a few people into my orbit. And 6s are wild in terms of how different they can be between subtypes. You can get a loyalist who is going to be very dutiful. And this is the traditional way we understand the 6, often called the loyalist. But it's when it's all about their relationship to authority. All head types, but especially with the 6. And the 6 is like, if I find an authority that passes my trust test, I may just be like totally on board with that authority because this is where I'm safe. And then there's another subtype of 6s, the self-preservation, which is like, I'm going to like align with authority by kind of being a warm, almost like a bunny rabbit. I'm a warm 6. And then there is the 6 that like it looks like an 8 and will like kind of come across as like a bulldog, kind of be aggressive against this perceived authority to like fend off the threat. But they're not an 8. They're a 6 and they're in fear. And so those are really 3 very different variations of 6. Finally, 7, they underdo fear by running away from it in their like enthusiasm. And so they're like, ha ha, I'm thinking about the future. What's the shiny new object? What's really cool and fun and neat and interesting? And that's the enthusiast and their relationship to authority. Like I said, all head types have it. Theirs is, I'm going to charm authority. And I don't really want to be in authority because then I have to it's not as fun and sunshiny. I want to be friends and, and like, and so it's really interesting. We talk
I
about
love the impressions, by the way, Chad.
Well, there is an
brings it really
embodiment.
closer. Yeah.
Yeah, there is this, and there's interesting things that I do in some workshops where we do the mudras, which are like to embody the passion of each type. And that really is illuminating for people to just see like, what's the passion sort of embodied. But so I don't know, how does some of that help as a beginning point?
I think like for me, it illuminated, first of all, that the way you described it, at least, was the 5 was the closest, or feeling like where lit up the most. It was like, oh yeah, damn it, that's happening. Oh yeah. But I also do feel like that. So
I would say just in the energy that I perceive from you, which is, I think there's a real value of just, even as we don't want to assume someone's something that they may be not. At the same time, we get experience, we have insights, we see things. And I do get more of a cooler vibe from you, a little bit more of a 5-ish energy than I do from certainly a 2. Mm-hmm. 2 is a little bit of a different, like, because so these heart types, they are really thinking about they're very image conscious. How am I being seen? And how am I seeing them? And are we connecting? And it's like this, like, there's this unconscious thing of like, who am I connecting with? 5s, no, not. They're cool and they're thinking, they're processing and they're thinking. And anyway, I have a lot of 5 friends, and where I connect with 5s as a 4, where I connect. So we have a relationship, we have that neighboring style, which people often call the wing. And I get along wonderfully with 5s. What do I love about 5s? I love their erudition, their depth of knowledge. And they too value depth in a knowledge way, which, the 4 gets, everybody just talks about the 4 being so emotional or dramatic or melancholic, all these things. But what's lost is they do have this neighboring style of a head type. And 4s are probably the most heady or intellectual of the heart types. Partly due, I think, to that neighboring wing of the 5. Where do I disconnect from the 5? I'm wanting 5s to be more, relational, and can we connect, and they're more like, yes, Chad, we sure, let's mountain bike, or do something. But there is this kind of elusive emotional connecting boundary. This is part of what I mean by like, this is helpful to know interrelationally when I I didn't know my 5 friend was a 5 or that I was a 4. Now I know all of this stuff. So what was like missing? And it's like that explains it. And it gives you
Mm,
grace and compassion for both what you're needing as well as what you can expect from others.
all right. I think that's very valuable. So understanding your type and what you need. I think you described it as sort of the passion and sort of the, what is it, the negative aspect or their shadow in a way. In other words, I guess, is I think very helpful, illuminating. Because for me, what was the 5 types? Like, what's the negative part of the 5, for example, the shadow aspect, their fear.
Yeah, well, for it's that holding, they feel the fear, but they kind of resist it by just creating a real shell, a real boundary. So,
Mm,
I mean, growth work for 5s, especially with their close relationships, is twofold at least. It's like it's work on listening to your emotions and being more comfortable with what they're telling you. Be more emotionally available. And then similarly, be more present in the moment. You don't have to like save your feelings for the privacy of your innermost soul later on. You can be present and feel things, enjoy now, right? In that
mm.
spiritual present moment idea.
Okay, that's I think very very good. When I think about and I'm bringing it now to the theme. When I think about people who are in a doubt, or people who are struggling with anxiety, people who are like not indecisive, not knowing where to go, what I perceive, and obviously it's also part of my personality a little bit, that I jump into thinking, so not in the present moment, in the future most of the times.
Mhm.
And there's constantly this feeling of anxiety or something being wrong, or something needs to change. So it sounds like this is sort of a head type thing, dealing with fear, dealing with anxiety, something like that.
Yeah.
Is there something that for those people, including me, you would suggest, or what is the help for type 5 or people who worry or are doubtful? What would the Enneagram suggest in that case?
Well, knowing if we're sticking with through the lens of thinking of the Enneagram, first of all, yeah, knowing that one is in fear a lot and that it's often associated with anxiety is helpful right there, right? Um, and then I would again, and when we begin like coaching in through this lens, we think of the passions. And the passion of the 5 is avarice, which is not greed. It doesn't mean greed. It means this whole withholding, this withholding in of, the privacy of what's going on in your head and in your mind. And you don't really, it's so independent. And independence, great, but other people that are close to you in your life may want to be a part more of your world, may either need things from you you're not aware of not giving, and that you yourself may need things that you're not asking for or receiving. And so just understanding that passion is super helpful. To answer your question, a lot of, there is a lot of theory about, well, what are some first steps to do through this lens of the Enneagram. And it's why you want to understand all the types and not just your type, is this idea of wing work. Now, it is so commonly misused of like, I'm a 5 with the 4 wing, or I'm a 5 with the 6 wing. Well, okay. So what that is descriptive of you are pretty sure of your type, and you're also aware that you unconsciously lean into one of your neighboring styles, your wing. Maybe you're more familiar with defaulting to, but in the end, if we're going to use this for growth work, we're going to want to consciously and intentionally work into understanding both of the wings. And these are simpler ego constructions to work with because they call this evolutionary work. just kind of expanding. So breaking out, say if you're a 5, you would first like be familiar, if you could, with what's it like in 4 land? What's it like standing over here? And then you'd be like, okay, and how can I appreciate being in 6 land? It's growth where you need both wings to fly, that kind of idea. And it's again called evolutionary work, is in that it's the first earlier steps that would be easier to embody and work on as much as they could. And then there are these arrows. And a lot of the arrow theory can get complicated, but you'll see all those arrows right on the Enneagram. And you generally have kind of what they call a first arrow. We call it the energizing arrow, because it's the very first arrow that you need to go to that is important for growth. We call the arrow work more revolutionary. So it's harder for this big leap to happen for your type. And so for a 5, your arrows, your energizing arrow points to 1. And your resolution arrow, the second one, points to 8, I believe. And so what do these have to teach you? And if you're a 5, and so and every one of these dynamics is fascinating. So if you look at the triangle, right, it's like 3s, 9s, and 6s are all in the center of their center of intelligence. So when they do wing work, it's interesting, they stay in their center of intelligence. But when they do the arrow work, they all leave their center of intelligence. Interesting stuff, but this doesn't apply for every type. Me as a 4, I go, well, to my 3 in my center of intelligence. What does it mean to be more of a productive performer, not getting lost in my emotions, those, and then it takes me through that big chasm into the head type territory and into being a 5, so a different center of intelligence. But my very first arrow, my energizing arrow, takes me to 1. And doing things right, doing things like with integrity, following through. Everything that I do doesn't have to be extraordinary. It can just be methodical and solid. And and then my second one would take me to 2. What is it? And what I think about being in 2 is to get out of my self-referencing behavior of like having to internalize everything and wrestle with being, and it's like, what would it be like to just completely think about meeting other people's needs and completely think about being likable and getting needs met from others by doing them right. So that is kind of where the application of some of that theory can be. And I'm going to say, I rush to say really quickly that we can go to any wing or any arrow unconsciously or consciously. And we can go to the low sides of these things as well as the high sides. And so when we're talking about it with growth work, we're talking about going to the high sides, the virtues of any of these given types.
Okay, I think what I get now, at least from your explanation, is that, okay, you have sort of figured your container where you most of the time behave.
Right.
And when you notice, oh, I'm more on the shadow side, the dark side of it, or you're not expressing yourself fully or feel good in it, there are these arrows or wings that have different abilities, and you can try out putting on that suit or that container and see, hey, what happens if I try, instead of being a 5, just maybe what you said, a bit more cool or more, focused on knowledge, to be a complete giver. What happens if I would go into the challenger and, go a bit more into conflict and see what happens when I oppose my opinions with others. And so just playing.
And that's hard for a 5. That's why it's like, that's more advanced personality work.
But there, notice you, at least how it sounds to me, is like you're giving a starting position, And now you can add different skills to it. Okay,
That is
let's say I'm in
right.
5. I want to challenge it. Like, I have all the knowledge now. I want to understand how I can oppose others and maybe be in conflict and find in conflict so I can spread my ideas. Something like that.
Yes. And, I see a lot of 5s, maybe not always as comfortable in that moving to that wing that you would think would be easier, that 4 wing. I don't see 5s naturally doing a lot of intentional work in feeling land so much. But I tell you, a lot of 5s go to that one arrow and like are really like athletic and do like, and that is massive growth work for them. They get out of their heads and they go and they do a lot of running or a lot of biking or powerlifting. 5s are crazy athletic in some of these ways, which is fascinating. So I think, yes, like you can be like, you know what? I see, what does it mean to be in a body center of intelligence when I'm always in my head, for
Wow.
instance?
Yeah, okay, so you've been talking a lot about growth work really now with the Enneagram,
Yeah.
but a big chunk of what you do, or at least you've written about it, is also the topic of calm
Mm.
and insight and understanding yourself. So when I think about people who are in doubt, that are doubtless, that are anxious, that are maybe in this head center of the Enneagram, then immediately what comes up to me and what helped me tremendously is some sort of practicing calm. And so I want to bring that in as well as sort of a tool, but also let's just discuss, because what I found in your what is it, like a little free ebook that you have, is
Yeah.
it's very interesting to deal with things, deal with emotions, deal with triggers when you're not calm and when you are calm.
Yes.
So one thing that you had written there, I think a section about, is what happens if you're irritated. And there are multiple ways what happens, like when you're calm, when you're not calm. So I think there's a big chunk coming in when you have this emotion, when you have this anxiety, when you have difficult emotion, whatever it might be, right? There's no
Yeah.
good or bad emotion, just one that you like and then that you don't like. And what happens if anger, if anxiety, whatever is that bad emotion comes up? And how does calm or meditation play a role in that?
Well, what a great question. Yeah, and it's so true. Like when I was really thinking about writing this, I think in 2020, about, calm is so important. I felt, besides self-knowledge, I was like, the most important. So we wrote that first book with Big Self School on self-knowledge. And I was like, well, what's the next one? I'm like, well, it's calm. But that sounds so boring.
Yes.
How do we make calm exciting? And I don't know that we do. I don't know if it's our place to do that, but it's almost like it is a principal building block for like beginning a lot of this work. And, we generally know it and understand it through, Americans have really embraced the term mindfulness. But in general, it is meditation. And that really, mindfulness, in my view, is no different. It's completely synonymous with meditation. I don't, it's because we're always connecting our body, and an awareness through slowing down and breathing. And I do tend to think that culturally, we tend to be in our heads, or we tend to be in a lot of reactive emotions. And there's been actually in the past 30 years a lot, finally, we're in we're since the Enlightenment, for a couple of hundred years, we've definitely been like prizing what's going on in the head over everything. And that's been great. And then over the past 30 years, we've done a lot of emotional intelligence work, and EQ is considered highly valued. And I am just now beginning to see everywhere I look, like all kinds of coaches and all kinds of contexts are talking about this idea of what's going on in your body. How is that connected to everything? And, to answer your question, Julian, it's like when we're calmer and there's so many ways to achieve it. When we slow down, we can be less reactive. We can be more aware of how we're beginning to have our knee-jerk response. And yeah, I just took an 8-week mindfulness training course because I wanted to work and practice this more. And I learned how many different manifestations reactivity can come up, and how important it is to practice all the time, and how hard it is. And it's humbling, right? It's like we can have a lot of knowledge and we can understand and we do a lot of work, and yet you could be driving on the road and somebody cuts you off and you immediately feel like you're reactive.
Yeah.
And it reveals that you're not as centered as you thought you were. That's tiny side. We'll keep staying here with calm for a minute, but it's like, I remember in the late 20 teens, I would show up to work and I would be feeling I'm neutral. I'm fine. I'm regular. I'm neither high nor low. All of these things. But people would be kind of responding in this like way of thinking, come on, man, cheer up. Like, what? And it's like you realize the fish that you're swimming in, the water you're swimming in as the fish is not as aware of your body language and the language you're literally using as you think you are, without doing a lot of work. And it's not just all head work. And that it's really where the work begins, right? It's the work of slowing ourselves down, calming, bringing ourselves into awareness. And I think it's super important. It's not something we find. Like, knowledge, maybe you go find, but awareness and calmness, you allow to happen. And that's the wonderful thing. It's always there. It's very democratic. It's not demanding. It's not saying you need to be calm. No, it's just saying, if you allow me to come in, I'm here. And yes, the book does talk about different ways to do it. And I think it's important, right? Nature teaches us so much and can calm our nerves, and all of these empirical ways that have been studied. Cold water therapy. Oh, everyone's ice plunging now. It's so nice to know. To get in super cold water is really good for you because it doesn't seem like that. And yes, there's all these applications. There's things to like have a 1-minute pause, have a 5-minute pause. Any formal practices we do in the mornings or nights with meditation are great. They're really great. They're really important. I challenge people to try to adopt one. But the real practice, just like in a coaching session, right? You might have this great big awareness in a coaching session, but how do you go practice in between your coaching sessions? What are you doing informally? And that is where the work is, right? So we do the meditation so that for the rest of the day, we can keep bringing ourselves back there, keep bringing ourselves to calm,
and be on
so that
Instagram.
we're able to get a little bit into higher consciousness. What did you say?
We can calm our minds and be in meditation to be calm on Instagram. No, like
Sure.
I 100% agree, because like the way I see meditation, for me also a daily practice by now, is that I practice to be better at life, not be better at meditation. And that
That's
was
right.
like the way that was described by Light Watkins, sort of a Vedic meditation teacher, was very insightful. It was like, because before I was trying to be more present, be more concentrated in meditation. Right. I learned it before. It's like the idea was like concentrate more. And then I was like, oh, the meditation was good or it's not good.
Right.
But the goal of meditation is not to be good at meditation. The goal of meditation is to be good at life. So that helps you to stay more aware, more mindful throughout the day, actually.
Right, right. And we don't want our personality construct to be making demands on the effectiveness or ineffectiveness, either saying, what a good job you're doing, or that wasn't so good. Where is that coming from? Right. That's in our ego. Those are stories we're telling ourselves. So just to your point.
Yeah. And I think that's a great one as well. The topic there just scratch, which is the stories we tell ourselves, about being good, being not good. I guess expectations and judgment come into play here as well, because we have I don't know if you know Mo Goddard. He's been having the Slow Mo podcast as well, and he's a former chief business officer of Google X. And one interesting thing about it is that he is very engineer, methodical, mathematical about the world. And he created an equation on being happy, which is essentially very simple, but it describes pretty much the idea of, hey, I have an expectation about how the world should be. If I subtract from that expectation the reality, I see how happy I am. And sort of like the inverse effect of that is like how happy I am. My expectation is here, my life, or today, it's going to be grandiose. I feel like I'm happy. I feel like I make, I don't know, X amount of money. And the reality is just lower than that. I will feel bad. However, if the opposite happens, you're like expecting, I don't know, I make a year 50K, and suddenly it happens, I make 70. You're like, oh, great stuff. How lucky I am. Yeah. Even though the opposite might be true, that all your friends are making, I don't know, then maybe the opposite, 70K, and you just make 50K, and you think, oh my God, I'm so bad at life. I can't do things. And, just based on the expectation, which is, I think, a very interesting perception.
It is. I love the mathematical description of happiness that you are talking about, and how in some ways, I guess it can be quantified like that. And yeah, that my Calm book, what was it? It was What Do You Expect? And because yes, but it's one of those things that it's like easier to describe than fully practice or understand, because what are we supposed to do? Go around with low expectations, or like not have too high of expectations for life, because then we'll just be disappointed? Not really, right? So
I want to bring in the story of the monk that he had in the book, which I found very amusing and somewhat true as well, which was, I think, who was it? Kamal Ravikant, I think, was asking a monk after he did a retreat. So I came up with the question. The question is, how do you actually find peace? And the monk was then answering, that's a funny and easy question to answer. I say yes to everything. Yes to life. Yes to whatever is right now. Because if you say no, if you say, it should be different, then you're in resistance with reality. And so then you always lose. So you always have to accept whatever is there. You have to say yes to life.
Right. And I think that part of the pulling out there's this huge emphasis on being super present and being in the present moment. And we're creating the future by how we're embodying the present. But in general, what life is teaching me right now, and what that illustration suggests as well, is this, idea of really trying to be more open to listening to what life is bringing to us now. And it was pretty recent, like when I was doing some, like, I've been doing some self work on, kind of knowing that like my social instinct has been always in my life a little bit repressed. And, some of my growth work has been to like try to bring out that repressed social instinct a little bit more. And in that, I made a declaration of like, just say yes. Just say yes to things that you probably would have just said, yeah, no, thanks. And it's led to a lot of things. It's just beginning. I feel like it has been a short amount of time, but one of those things was, just as a quick anecdote, it was like, I had an opportunity. I was invited to, someone submitted me to be a part of the leadership Chattanooga class of 2024, which is a 10-month program, up to like 40 people. And you go to a monthly engagement. And my first impression was like, I don't need to do that. No, that sounds like a lot of work. It's a lot of awkward conversation. No, but I was saying yes, and so I applied and I got in, and I had a 10-month journey with these wonderful people that I never would have met, and I never would have had these experiences. And I'm doing that in a lot of ways. And I'm also doing that like with Big Self School itself. It's like, well, our mantra is play big without the burnout, right? So play big. How have I not been playing big? And so by saying yes, being open to the possibilities, it's bringing more reality into being than I previously recognized as being possible. So I do think that like this stuff is powerful stuff, and it's cheap when someone just tries to just talk about it but doesn't live it. And you do have to live and practice this stuff all of your life. So I by no means am putting myself in an authority position of, just because I'm a coach and just because I've written a book on the Enneagram or Calm for, it's like those were, writing those things were a part of my natural skill set and, a calling that I feel. And there are other things, you talked about me being a writer early on. It's like, yeah, that was a part of what brought me into what I felt like was a calling or meaningful work. And I feel like in this part of my life, there's more that's out there as a possibility for me. And I don't need to have self-limiting beliefs of, oh, you're just a nerdy intellectual writer. You just need to stay quiet behind your walls and your screen. And so that's been really wonderful and sometimes difficult growth work.
So it sounds like you were at first jumping into, okay, what is the container I'm in? And now with that saying, yes, okay, I've realized that container. Now let me expand it. Let me get out of it. Let me find new ways actually to explore the whole reality of things, not like limiting yourself to that container that you found yourself in, but being able to, okay, let's check out what else I can do, what other skills are there to be learned for you.
Yeah. And so to what you're just saying there about, it's like one of the things that we do, when you mentioned how there's no bad or good emotion. And I agree to the extent that like, I'm glad that all the emotions exist because they're possibilities, right? But I do also agree with like, there are like gradations of what we would call more negative emotions. And then there's this time where we enter into positive emotion territory and have a much more powerful, energetic thing that we bring to life. And so the passion, I'm making, and I think a connection here to what you're saying is one easier way to identify how we're growing is to maybe not even have to like leave the jail cell or the boundary of, say, I'm, in foreland. And it's more like, well, how can I just aspire to the high sides of it? What are the good qualities of it? And when we're in this passion, the passion's considered a lower level emotion. A not as aware, like kind of unconscious emotion. And so, actually, if we run around the circle and we can, but it's like eights are in eights are in lust, like one big energy for something at a time. Nines are in sloth, which doesn't mean laziness, but it's inattention and laziness to self, what's going on inside. Ones are in anger. Twos are in pride, which is interesting. It's hidden. You wouldn't think that that is about a two. Pride is their passion. Threes, it's some call it vanity, some call it self-deceit. Fours, envy. Fives, avarice. Six, fear. And seven is gluttony. Not the same thing as lust. Gluttony is like, what's the giant? Let me, like, what's the next thing? And lust is like one big, real big, powerful energy I'm bringing to one thing at a time. But what about those? When we are closed and defensive and just trying to just like prove everyone that we're right about where we are, we stay operating there. And when we do begin to go, oh, okay. Oh, yeah. I'm in envy right now. And how do I get out of this? And then we can go like, okay, well, how can I say yes? How can I be more open to learning that beginner's mindset idea and break free from those constrictions? I think actually it's interesting about spotting the passion early on in the work when we become aware that that's where a lot of work happens, just observing in a non-judgmental way. Because and some are maybe easier to see than others, but like for me, envy, when I was first told as a 4 that I was in envy, I was like, not really, I literally, that was my response. And I understood the difference between envy and jealousy. Jealousy is like you deserve something that someone else has and you feel like you should have that. And envy is like, someone has something that I don't have. And I must not be as good. I'm a little lacking. And this constant 4s, when they compare, they're usually on the lower end. And then that leads to this, yeah, I could be great, but I don't have that. And so I'm kind of, and it's unconscious, And so understanding it, to observe it, and then be able to go, okay, it's okay for someone to have this. It doesn't mean anything about you. You are great and whole in who you are in and of itself. And so, that comparison thing, that needing to feel superior or inferior can slowly go away. But I will just say that like it wasn't immediately available or obvious to me.
That's, I think, a very important point to just see like the details in the nuances, that's the word, between those different ways that you're behaving. And it all comes with more and more self-insight and self-awareness. At least that's how I perceive it now. And I think that's most of the work I do with a lot of my clients too. It's just bringing awareness. Like in those sessions, you notice, hey, you've been repeating this pattern, this story. Hey, you've come up with those things. And just mirroring that is one of the best tools.
That is so true.
And yeah, you know that as well with the Enneagram coaching. But when people are now like feeling attracted to either the Enneagram or just when they notice, okay, I've gotten some insight through this now, what could be a first practical step for people to continue this journey on self-awareness, self-insight? What would you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, so what you're saying is a method of a really effective method in coaching is just this idea of what you're saying, mirroring back to them what they've said, or reflective inquiry, just like sort of like letting them know that they're heard, but then also they have the ability to hear themselves. And we don't even realize the language we're using or the beliefs that we may have until we hear it kind of reflected back to us in a trusted space. But it's not just always asking the magical question that I think a lot of people think it is. I would say that, like in general, though, a part of the coaching conversation arc that I love to practice with my clients in when they want to do this part of it, it's like awareness is great, right? Like it's kind of seeing something is great. It's satisfying. It's like, oh, they feel like they've gotten something. The coach feels good because their client feels good, and but if no action is taken on the awareness, if no intention is there, then it can easily fade away. So I would say that whatever awareness that is coming up for you right now, to, we use this language of make a declaration, say it out loud, because language is powerful. I know that actions are more important than words, but language is very powerful. It leads to actions, and saying something out loud, even to
Mm.
yourself or one other person, much less many, it's literally reported that there's a much higher percentage of likelihood that you'll actually follow through on that declaration and you'll actually commit to the action. And so I would say make it a small action, make it something that feels doable, and and do it, right? And
Mhm.
and try to release the things that are blocking you and those beliefs, but that's maybe another step. Bring your awareness into action.
Wonderful. All right. I think this is a great conversation towards understanding yourself, creating self-awareness, and maybe with the tool of the Enneagram, creating even more awareness for that container that you're in. If you have something that's
Thank
coming
you.
up now that you would love to share as well, that might give another insight, that might give something to hold on to, or just a little quote or summary of this conversation, now is the time. The 30 seconds are yours.
Well, I feel like it we have said it, but I would like, I guess maybe early, you don't need a test. You don't need to go find the right test. We do have a really great test at our at Big Self School, but you don't need it. You need curiosity and reading a good book or two. In fact, I would say don't take a cheap free test because it can be very misleading and confusing. Learn about the types, because it's also not just about learning your type, it's about learning humans,
Hmm.
and it will give you great insight and depth to know that, to know how these other people are going around, and it'll give you compassion for yourself and for others as well.
All right, that's wonderful. Not just for yourself, but also understanding others. I think that has given me such an advantage in so many cases as well. So it's a great advice. All right, then I think we're getting to the end of this amazing conversation. I enjoy it very much, Chad, and the deep insight and the nuances that you've given with the Enneagram has alleviated a little bit of my, first maybe hesitation or doubt that I have had before with the topic itself, and seen it as the possibility for self-insight, especially also when you described those types for me again. I was like, oh, what? It's actually pretty obvious that it's a 5. But just through the other parts that I've read on the internet, I was like, okay, that doesn't make sense. I'm a what is it? A 2, 5, and 9. So thank you for bringing some clarity into that.
Yeah.
And I know you went really deep into the Enneagram, and not only just in general, but you also went quite deep into the Enneagram and burnout and stress. You called it the shock point, And you've written a book actually about that. And that can be found on Amazon as far as I know. I'll put the link also in the show notes, which dives really deep into what are the, I guess, reasons that we might go into stress, the difficulties that why is stress created for different types of people, and then obviously also help resolve that. So thank you so much for writing that. I'll put that in the show notes so people can find if they really want to dive deeper into the work that you do, especially connected to burnout and stress.
Yes. The first couple of sections, one's on burnout and the history of it, and one is on stress. But if you already know a lot about that, I tell you, just as an Enneagram book that dives into subtypes and understanding those as well, which is not commonly understood, I think the book could be really valuable to folks, and it is written in a way that I hope is really conversational and relational and not overly scholastic or scholarly. So thanks for highlighting that. I appreciate it. I do think it is it's doing well, and we use it a lot, and I think it could be really powerful for an understanding overview of your personality type.
Awesome. Thank you so much for doing this work to demystifying a little bit this complex topic of the Enneagram, and for bringing some light to me and for everybody who's listening.
Well, I'm happy to be a part of this conversation in general, and thank you specifically for the opportunity to be on your podcast, your show with your listeners, Julian, and thanks for like your appreciation of wanting to go deep and having these kinds of rich conversations. So I hope that it is of value to your listeners who want this kind of depth.
Yeah, and I told you before, there's so many other topics that I didn't even get to touch on. So we'll see. Maybe soon in the future we have some more time to dive even deeper in some of the other topics. Because
Sounds delightful.
I'm really happy to jump deeper into the depth of understanding humanity and purpose and balance and desire. I think there's so many topics that are still open. So yeah, if you're open, we'll soon have another one.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that opportunity, and thanks for the good work you're doing in the world as well.
Thank you so much. Awesome. You listened to the full episode. Your investment to a more calm, confident, and doubtless self. Now you can make a commitment to yourself and help others discover this podcast. Simply by subscribing and following the podcast on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. I hope to see you here soon again for the new episode dropping every other Thursday. Talk soon.